There were some last minute additions and the owl was not cooperating. But my name's Ian. I'm one of the library assistants here, and this is the second of 3 for the Games Done Local series. Last week was video games. This time we'll talk board games. Next week it's actually back to video games again, but same time right here in the Commons on Thursday. Today we have Adam Stichter from Jackapese Games. He's got kind of a whole plan. Yeah, I put it out in the sheets there, and like I said when I was handing them out, keep them. There are some shortage codes at the bottom. I'm going to turn it over to Adam because he's got everything organized way better than I do.
Cool. Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm Adam Stichter. I design board games. I design puzzles, and yeah, I worked at the Code and Key escape rooms. Now Get Out Bloomington. So if you haven't checked out escape rooms, very fun. Anyway. I also design and publish card games through Jackapese Games. So this is kind of my overview of how I go from an idea to a finished product. It's going to be a broad overview, and if you want to ask questions, we'll do that I think at the end, and then we'll actually have like a session of practicality if you want to try your hand at designing something. So we'll kind of go through all of that. So. Jackapese Games is a company that I made to publish some designs because with the ethos that games don't have to be about war or about conflict to be interesting or to be fun. So it's kind of like it focuses on the peace aspect and also about the ethical aspect. So I try to do things as ethically as possible when both designing and manufacturing games, things of that nature. So it is a local company. Obviously, I run it out of my house. And we do print-on-demand games here in the US. So it's printed and shipped within the US. So it's not overseas and doesn't have that sort of carbon footprint with it. Yeah, and I also design just other games. I've got Kaboom, which is a design that I'm designing right now. So if you want to see a game in process, I can pull that out for you later. I've also got my other 3 games here.
Grab the remote there. Just click later.
Perfect timing. Super Awesome Monster Cuddle Party, which is a bocce-style throwing card game. My Small Garden, which is kind of out here. It's a puzzle placement game where you're trying to properly place your potted plants. And Spotlight, which is a deduction and secret kind of like area control game. So I've designed and published these myself through Jackapese Games. And so I'll just go pretty much through my process of what I do. So I go from idea. So I get ideas in a lot of different places. It could be playing other board games. It could be watching movies. I've gotten a few ideas, just kind of like, how would I take the story of this movie and change it into a board game? Like, what mechanics, what things are they doing? How could that be made into just a game of paper, cardboard, dice, other simple objects that a person can actually run? And I write down all of my ideas that I can. I have several notebooks. I usually have one running for puzzles, one running for board game design, and one running for everything else that I tend to think of. I also have a lot of different like cards or other sort of pieces lying about. I brought some of those. You can kind of see some of them on the table. I have just kind of a general assortment of like things that I use. And I play with it. So I figure out what's interesting to me, like what ideas stick, what kind of keeps and grabs my attention, and I'll go with that. I suggest to people who are interested in game design but haven't designed anything yet or haven't like really dipped their toes in, go ahead and make an expansion for a game you know well. Because you already know the mechanics of how it works, you know kind of what's fun about it, and there might be like interesting ideas you have like, oh, this might be interesting to explore or like do in the game, right? So actually, the activity that we can do afterwards, if you all want to stick around, is I brought some very simple kind of like children's games that a lot of people know, and it's easy to understand the mechanics. you can add one thing onto it, and it makes it, I think personally, infinitely better. Having played a lot of these games with my kids. So like, that's a way to dip your toes into game design and just kind of feel out how this actually works in practice. So the prototype stage. So going from like an idea to a prototype, ideas also just play around with it, right? If an idea sounds interesting, making something as quickly as possible out of like paper, cardboard, whatever, like it doesn't have to be pretty, or using cards that you have lying around. And like testing it out is the best way to figure out if a game is actually one, playable, if it's fun. If it's not playable or fun, you probably shouldn't spend a whole bunch of time developing it. But going quickly into that, is this a fun play space? Is this making me make interesting choices? Am I enjoying this process? Will kind of like give you an idea of whether it's going to be enjoyable to develop further. Because if you're developing a game, hopefully it's fun for you to develop and not just a slog, that sort of thing. I wouldn't recommend it unless you're like actively working in game design or something like that. Sometimes it can become a slog. But you'll notice like this is the beginning of my small garden. So my small garden ended up like this, cards and a grid, that sort of thing. I had an idea for a ladder style game where you were going to be buying cards and the cards had different abilities. And it was kind of going to be a deck builder as well, where you were drawing a certain number of cards and you were kind of laying them down or laying one down, and building out this like overlapping ladder structure. So I was playing with space and how cards were placed on the table, and that kind of gave me an idea for playing cards next to each other and like maybe playing some cards face down, some cards face up. I just like played with that physicalness of it and tried to figure out if that physicalness worked, right? Like just playing the cards down on the table, maybe some of them face down, some of them face up, flipping cards over, that sort of thing, and figured out if that action was fun or interesting. And then I actually made, I guess, a prototype, right? Like after testing the idea a little bit, I made a prototype, and this is a much more finished prototype than I usually get into. So this has like a theme. The theme is you're decorating a dragon's lair and you want to do it well, otherwise the dragon will eat you at the end. So like even though my publishing company is Jack Beast Games, not all of my games start out as like, oh, we're like that conflict like thing. I still have to wrestle with that sometimes. So, but this is a game of like just like you're placing down numbers, trying to figure out, okay, do some of these like numbers work well next to each other? I think it might have been, 30 cards at the beginning, but all of the cards were kind of in and they all had pluses and minuses next to them instead of half the cards being a separate deck. And then also I had it points based, where you were trying to get a certain number of points. So you had like these like goals and tallying up points as a part of the game. And the like going through the process of it all, I realized that this part of like tallying up points and figuring that out was too complicated, right, for this style of game that I wanted it to be, for the type of game that it needed to be. Like I realized that it was also too complicated to have all the cards have these pluses and minuses on them, to where the card underneath this one needs to be a higher number, but then when you flip it over, it also has pluses and minuses on it. So does that card need to correspond to that one as well? And it was really confusing how the interaction of the cards were happening. And so just playing with this quick, and you can see I also had these ideas, what became the pots on the cards, the planters that the plants are in, these like shapes. I drew those shapes onto the cards I was like, okay, we're just gonna, it's cardstock. I'm just gonna draw shapes on them. We're gonna test out this idea as quick and dirty as possible. You know, that sort of thing. So this was kind of the next iteration that I did, where you can tell that my printer is running out of ink at this point. But then I got kind of the pots. I grabbed some art assets that I actually ended up editing and using later on. But you have the pluses and minuses. I have a multiple of 3 here instead of a multiple of 4. So that's a little bit different. And which pots had numbers, which pots didn't, weren't as rigid. So I think I randomized that a little bit more. This one I actually think, yeah, there's 2 pots with 11s. So I experimented with how many, what the numbers ratios were, right? So I experimented with maybe I only go up to 15. And I do from 1 to 15, and multiple pots might have the same numbers. But I also felt that was confusing. So I split them up later on and didn't duplicate numbers. And then also I'm still working about the points thing and scoring points. I'm trying to figure that out and trying to figure out if this works or if this doesn't work. So prototyping, essentially you're going to be updating your game, you're going to be playing your game, you're going to take notes, especially if you play with other people. Take notes about what they think, what their feedback is. So I always write down feedback from anybody who gives it, just to be respectful of them, really. But the goal is to find what resonates with players, where they find fun, and where their hang-ups are, and where they're not understanding things, because that means that I can either explain it better, or I need to probably cut something, or streamline something on that aspect of it. A lot of playtesting is refining how the game either works or cutting things that don't make sense, right? So I have down here, don't always take a playtester's feedback or solutions at face value. I know I offer solutions a lot. You're the game designer. The solutions are your domain to control, right? You know the direction you want your game to go in. If somebody offers a solution, they don't know the hard work you put in to this point, the things that you've already tried, all of that area and everything like that. And so trying to find what their frustration is and where they think needs improved is going to help you more than actually trying to implement their solutions. So that solution is your responsibility, your ability to implement the game. I use Affinity Publisher. I know a lot of people use Adobe InDesign, and there's a lot of other programs out there that allow you to put a spreadsheet in and link art assets and other stuff like that. I use this so that I can do quick game design for the prototyping stage, because usually it's a lot easier for me to go in and change the value on a spreadsheet and then print off a new thing and cut out some cards than it is for me to sometimes go in and hand draw everything by hand, that sort of thing regularly. And it also allows me to keep a record of what I tried. So I can write notes on the spreadsheet. I can also duplicate a spreadsheet or whatever and kind of run off of that thing. And this is just a process of repeating and repeating and playing and playing and playing. You're going to be doing this a lot. So this is the stage that you probably spend 50% of your time in, depending on where the next stage is and what you're going to do with the production side of it. So this is me recording a how-to video, which is really helpful. So because you write the rules, right? Writing the rules is also a part of, I think, playtesting the rules, because your people are your computers. If you think of video game design, you have a computer that runs all the animations, you have a computer that interprets the movements from the buttons and that sort of thing, and then does something on the screen, right? You don't have the luxury of something being done for the player. The player has to do the flipping of the cards or the rolling of the dice or all of this stuff. Your player is technically your computer. They do all the computations, they do all of the movements, they enact all of the rules. And so playtesting the rules is going to be an important part of prototyping and playtesting, because if you don't have good rules, you might have a great game, but if nobody can play it, it's not going to be a good experience for anybody, right? So for me, running through a how-to video and like figuring out how to explain something in a really good way helps me write those rules and also helps me explain the core of the game and explain the things that are important to the game. Writing the rules down, I usually do that after I've played through the idea and I know that the idea is fun. Then I'll like try to figure out a basic rules kind of list or writing down the rules and figure out if those rules make sense while I'm, play testing, prototyping the game. A lot of designers won't write down rules until they know that they have 90% of a game, right? And if they can teach the game to other players and they can kind of like allow other players to play the game and the game is fun for other players, then going through and writing down the rules, because having players learn from a rule set is very different than having somebody explain it to them. So you're going to want to play test the rule set, the rules themselves, as much as you want to play test the game itself. So how do players take these rules, figure them out, and then actually play your game? The how to play really gave me a lot of like, oh, this thing, I need to make sure that, like this thing is like clear, understandable. How do I streamline the rules? How do I lay them out? So I have in this is a final production copy, but a lot of things changed from this version of the game from the one that I was printing off of my printer. So one, it's on like actual cards. So I use a print-on-demand service, usually drive-through cards, but also the Game Crafter, to print off either prototypes or final production copies. And the like the spacing of the cards. So this is like the graphic design area of the game, right? You want the graphic design to enhance and actually not distract from what your final game is. So this is what you're testing here in the kind of the early production phase. You're testing whether the graphic design holds up, whether it's understandable, intelligible, how it works, if people understand it. I mean, it's that aspect of playtesting again a little bit, where you're figuring out, is this intelligible? Is a game without somebody to explain it playable? Personally, I like drive-through cards better because they give better margins to their creators and they're not as expensive as the Game Crafter. But I do have $5 off Game Crafter coupons because the Game Crafter gives these things out like candy. All these pieces on the tables are also from the Game Crafter. They're from an event called Protospiel, and they give them out kind of at Protospiel to the game designers who come and play test their games. So there's actually a lot of events and other things that you can go to and take your games to in order to play test games, in order to like just play other unfinished games and figure out what people are doing in the space. Indianapolis has one yearly, Chicago has one, St. Louis has one. There's other smaller events around. And a lot of online playtesting happens as well. So there's a few programs that you can use to import games digitally and play like card games or, like they'll have dice or minis or things like that. And a lot of there's a few online communities that do regular online playtest sessions of just game developer people around the world. So I know Break My Game is the biggest one probably. And they have, I think, 3 different time zones that they kind of like do events on like a Saturday, I think. So there's like that going on. So there's a lot of different areas where you can like play test your games and get feedback. Getting feedback is important, especially like kind of the production side of things, because you want things to work. And then, so production. So for me, like a lot of these small card games, I was like, I'm just going to publish them myself. This seems interesting. So I do it print on demand. That means the game isn't made until somebody orders it. I also have them in several stores around town. So the Game Preserve has some copies. Get Out Bloomington has a few copies. And that's me buying the games in bulk and then taking them to those stores and saying, here's my games. So that's how that happens. But people can buy them online, get them printed out, that sort of thing. Also, another option is to, if you wanted to do it yourself, is to like crowdfund it. And that gives you essentially the bulk of money up front in order to order games from overseas or like in a bigger print run, because you already have that number of orders, they're locked in, and you get that money up front in order to then place that order. Unfortunately, crowdfunding is a blessing and a curse. I can talk to you about it a lot later if you want, but the expectations around crowdfunding have gone way up because it is the way that most board games are marketed now. So most board games, even if the publisher doesn't need to crowdfund it, it usually goes through crowdfunding. So like Kickstarter, GameFound, places like that, because the marketing draw is such a big thing. If people don't hear about it on Kickstarter, they're like, wait, did this game actually come out? Like, that sort of expectation. There's just that expectation now. So you have a lot more finished and a lot more like games that are essentially done except for their print run, except for printing and stocking them, right? So games look a lot better, the marketing's a lot better because you're competing on Kickstarter with large companies, not just small indie creators, right? And the level of attention and detail you have to do is much higher than it was 15 years ago, 10 years ago, right? So if you want to make it yourself, you can also hand make your game and make it a lovely handmade game, right? That is also a very valid option. I know there's a creator out of Norway, I want to say, what feels like up in that area of the world at least, who has a game that they sewed. And it is a game with, I really want it, but it's a game that kind of folds up into a bag and then you kind of unfold it, and it's this like war game with like little pieces and a map that's been sewed into the cloth. It looks really cool, but it's got that handmade aspect to it, which is really cool. But you could also just hand make your own cards, right? And put them in card sleeves if you want, or just make it yourself. And that is a very valid way, an awesome way to do game design and to make games. Games don't always have to be about publishing them out for a multitude of people to experience. Games can be about personal experience that you give your friends or family, that sort of thing. So, or you can get somebody else to make your game. Personally, I find this almost harder because it goes into, now that you won't go into a high production value if you are pitching your games to other companies that publish games as their business, because a lot of times they will take the bones that you've created and they might put a different theme on it or a different story to it. They'll put different artwork into it. They will change some things, right? Like you want to have a very good rule set written up and everything like that. But if they change some rules, right? Like you don't want to have like, oh, this card does exactly this, and I put this beautiful artwork to it, and then they're like, well, actually, we wanted to, make the game about pirates who are also rats. So there's. If you're pitching your game to another company, you want to have what's called a sell sheet that has kind of I didn't bring one with me, unless there's one in that box. I don't think there is. But it's a sell sheet, it's a sheet that has the basics of your game, kind of the hook of your game, what's interesting about your game, shows representation so that publishers can remember what your game is about. But you're also going to be building relationships with publishers. So the game design, at least the board game design industry, is very much about relationships. I don't know as much about the video game design industry, but I figure it's still that way a lot. There's a lot of collaboration in the board game design industry that isn't in a lot of other industries, which is really interesting. And it's possible that it's because it's about play and fun and kind of like that enjoyment and that communal hobby aspect that takes it to that place. But you want to build relationships because people talk to each other, and if you burn bridges, people will know. But if you have a game that you pitch to a publisher, so you take it to them, you're like, hey, here's my game, here's my sell sheet, this is how the game plays really quickly, and they're like, well, we're not really interested in this right now, but do you have anything else, right? So you can take multiple game designs with you that you feel like might fit the publisher, or you build a relationship because at some point in the future they might be looking for something else that you then are like, oh yeah, I built this thing, and they're like, oh great, we like that thing, and you were fun and cool, and we think we might like working with you because you're a cool person, right? So you're building those relationships with a publisher. Yeah, and conventions are a good place to do that. Gen Con is probably the worst convention to do that at because Gen Con is a selling convention. So it's the convention that in the United States, publishers sell new releases. So it's a kind of a hype building machine, and publishers are really busy during Gen Con. I do know that some publishers take meetings with people and play games and take pitches and stuff like that, but there's a lot of other smaller conventions that are a lot better to build those relationships with. Gen Con would be a good one if you have a publisher in mind for a game, or if you want to build a relationship with a publisher, go and volunteer at their booth or work at their booth so they get to know you better, so they get to know how you work, so you get to just build rapport with them, that sort of thing. And if you have a game or two that you've designed and they're interested then to hear about that, great. But going and trying to build those relationships and kind of get into the hobby or industry that way, it's kind of the way to do it. So I guess my best advice for this is to have fun, right? If you're not having fun designing these games, then if you want to do it for work, it'll take a lot of work, right? If you want to do it for fun, actually have fun with it. If it's not fun, then find a different project, right? So I bounce back between puzzle design and board game design a lot. So just that how long my attention goes for is about a month on a game design. And so if I don't finish it in a month, then it's like, okay, I'm gonna have to circle back around in a couple months, right? Or something like that, right? So that's how my brain works, and that's how I make sure that I'm having fun, that I'm experiencing those challenges well within the game design process. I guess now's the time for questions, answers, things you want me to elaborate on more, that sort of thing. Yeah.
One thing that I've always loved about your games is that they're very tactile and very unique. I love your card throwing game. I just think throwing cards is such a cool mechanic for a game. So you mentioned you jump back and forth between puzzles and cards. Mm-hmm. Do you think that tactileness is kind of the bleed through from the puzzle part of things, that tactility, or does it happen the other way? Do you have a lot of, with your puzzle building, you kind of...
Yeah. the puzzle building is like, I'm very spatially minded, and I think that comes through in kind of how I design games, because I think about layout a lot in game design, and actually all of my games are very spatially oriented. At least the ones that I publish through Japanese Games. And I think that's just because I'm very spatially oriented. The card throwing game idea came about because I was like, what are the different ways you can use cards? Like just going through trying to make a list of like,
Sure.
well, you could play them, like, right? Like maybe, or like you could slide them. Oh, that's interesting, right? Oh, you could throw some cards. That'd be interesting. You know, like that sort of like what different ways can you play with or do things with cards? And so that's how that game idea came about, is just the thinking about what can you do with cards. You can hold cards, you know, like you can, I mean, heaven forbid hold cards, right? I mean, Rhino Hero does that, funnily enough, as a part of the game. But I think Cat Tower also, there's like a Cat Tower game that also holds cards. Anyway. But yeah, I think it's mostly just how my brain works and how I work, and that bleeds through in both my puzzle design and my card game design. Yeah. Yeah. I think Ian was.
A millisecond faster.
I was just going to ask, like, you've designed both single player and multiplayer games. Like, how does the process differ for you in terms of like playtesting or like?
Yeah. So usually when I playtest any game at the very beginning to make sure it's like a fun idea, I will play it by myself, because pulling somebody in at that early of a stage is really difficult to do. Because you have to explain your idea, and then like if something doesn't work, you have to like be like, oh, but that's not working. I'm sorry about that. You know, like that sort of thing. Even like in the very early stages, playing all players by yourself can be very difficult, but it can be very good to see how like that happens. I find it very difficult because I can't keep the different players separate in my mind. So playing multiple people at the same time is one of the difficult things for me. But like then pulling in like another person if you need to. I have a co-designer on Spotlight because that's one of the things that was very difficult for me. And so we would design this together, like we play tested this together. He actually designed the solo mode for that game for me. But having that person to play with a lot is really helpful in developing the game. Solo's personally a lot easier for me because you can just play it, right? Like you don't have to have somebody else play it. You can just play it. Multiplayer, I feel like, is also a little bit harder because you do have to like play test it with a group of people. Like if your game plays up to 6, you should play test it with 6 several times, right? And figure out, is this working? Is it taking too long? Are people having fun if they're not actively playing? So the throwing card game that I have plays up to 6. I have expansions that play up to like 8 or something like that. And it is fun for the people who aren't playing because they get to watch the people who are playing. And that's maybe the most fun aspect of it, actually, is watching other people do crazy, silly things. And so play testing that was really good to verify that all aspects of that worked, like all player counts work. If you want a game to play, like I've had this happen as well, I want a game to play up to 4 people. So like Spotlight was this way. I play tested it at 4 people and it was a drag. It just wasn't working. People were like, yeah, it comes back around to me and I don't know what to do. Like the game state has changed so much that it's just not worth it for, like, I just don't feel like the cards that I'm playing are making an impact because it's changed so much every single time that it comes around. So I can't plan 3 other people's turns ahead of me, right? And so I cut it down to 3, right? And we played it at 3 and people are still kind of like, oh, it just still doesn't feel right. And I cut it down to 2 and I was like, okay, this is good, right? 2 is the good number for this. And being honest with yourself about that, because there are hopes that you have for this game, right? but being honest with yourself about how it's playing is important. I am still trying to develop that core idea that we came up with Spotlight and make it a 4-player game. I've got some ideas, but it makes it so that there's not as much interactivity between the players, so that players can plan a little bit more on their turns. So there's ways to do that, I think. Yeah, I don't know if I answered your question well. Yeah.
So when you're playtesting, I mean, you've just mentioned sort of like looking whether the people are having fun.
Yeah.
But do you guide them in some way to request specific feedback? Because I don't know, like in general, other life situations, I feel like people just say the randomest things.
Oh yeah.
So do you have like, I don't know, bullet points or like things that you go through?
Yeah, usually when I'm playtesting, it's helpful to have questions about what you want, like questions you want answered. So is this aspect of the game working, right? And so you might be focusing more on like, is this interaction working, or is this aspect of this mechanic working, or this aspect of play working? And you can ask questions specifically about that and how people felt when they were doing this action. That's usually very helpful. Also, I usually have a set of questions of like, what was the most fun that you had during the game, right? To kind of like draw people's, like, what did people enjoy, right? And then I was like, well, also the opposite of that, what did you hate about the game? Like, what was like, oh, this feels so bad, you know, like that sort of thing. Because you want to get people's feedback on that as well. Because if that probably reveals some area that's not streamlined enough, or that people don't understand, or that really just needs to be cut from the game. Like maybe it's something extra that doesn't enhance the core of the game and the core fun of the game. So yeah, usually I'll come in with a couple questions with a couple of things that I want feedback on. And usually through the course of the play, I'll write down notes. So if I'm not playing, even if I am playing along, I'll write down notes. Like, oh, this is going well. I need to do something about this, or this interaction was really weird. And then I'll ask people about those things a bit, and then I'll usually open it up kind of for general comments. But those can get really weird and like very sidetracky very fast, and so. Yeah, so coming in with a list of questions, I feel like is very important in game design or play testing. Yeah, either.
Oh, for me, I'm not a game designer. I'm not a person like you to design stuff like that. I'm more of a RC person and builds RC cars and RC airplanes and model stuff and mechanical things. And I can understand from your point of view the mechanical stuff behind it, how to put it together, how to fix it, how to modify it, how to make it where person A doesn't know what I'm talking about, I can easily explain to them what I'm doing. And that's why I like that, the thinking of what you're doing with that. It's like, it just gets my gear head going.
Yeah.
You're not wrong. A fairly frequent term for that in this particular industry, to best of my knowledge, is the engine. Is what drives the car, is what drives the game.
Yep, exactly.
And if I can relate to my mechanical knowledge and what I know about mechanics, I can probably easily translate that into gaming.
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah.
What are some ways that you translate an idea for like a theme or an experience that you want players to have? Maybe it's like this in a movie, translating that into like mechanics and rules and things like that.
Yeah, some of that is an experience of what is out there right now. So playing a lot of different games, or honestly, like I don't get to play as many games as I want to now. It's mostly watching videos of other people explaining games. So I have a breadth of knowledge enough, like I played enough board games that I can kind of like understand how games are played when somebody explains them, right? So I often watch like explainer videos or like how to plays, of how things are played, and what kind of interactions or things they're doing. One of the things, what's the name of that movie? I have a really tough time remembering names. Everything Everywhere All at Once. So that's a fantastic movie. I quite enjoyed it. I was like, okay, how could this be a card game, right? Like, so I find that in design it often helps to start with restrictions. So figuring out what your restrictions are. So maybe that's not, maybe that's like, oh, I only design card games, or maybe that's, oh, I only design with this specific story or theme in mind, right? Like those are restrictions, and I feel like starting with those kind of restrictions really helps. Or, oh, I want to design a trick-taking game, or something like that, right? So for Everything Everywhere All at Once, I was thinking about kind of the stages of, like, the movie is separated into these different acts. Like, how could I express those acts, or how can players progress through those acts, or jump from place to place, right? There's like reality jumping in the movie. So how can I kind of like have players jump from one reality to another? And the thought that I came up with, I haven't developed it or like really played with it a lot, but this kind of illustrates your point. It's like, oh, they find objects in their area. So maybe you're searching for objects that kind of go together and allow you to then, like, if you match enough objects, you can jump to the next reality, and then you gain a new ability in that new reality, right? So it's kind of this engine builder of like you're searching through a deck, or you're searching through things, or you're using cards' abilities to, like, in the reality that you're in, you match a couple things, you jump to a new reality, then you search through that deck, right? But you also have the abilities from your previous reality to draw on, that sort of thing. It kind of like sort of builds. And so the thought was maybe you're playing 2 people or 4 people against each other, and they're all kind of playing their own kind of reality jumping game. And maybe you can play cards that affect the other players, right? And so, like, in terms of like thinking about how that movie has its sections, or has its, like, what the characters are doing, and translating that into drawing or searching, or, you know, like those basic mechanics, and figuring that out. That's kind of how I sketched out that. A lot of times game design comes to me mechanically first more than thematically. So like this one, My Small Garden started out as like, it's a very basic numbers on a grid kind of game, right? But it started out, like, the theme was like way different. People were like, this feels weird. You're decorating for a dragon and they might eat you. Like, so I was like, okay, pivot. So the theme didn't come along with it until later, and it makes sense of like, oh, you're trying to make it aesthetically pleasing, and if some plants are bigger than others and block the sun from other plants, then they might cause the other plants to die. So there's a little bit of thematicness in that. I mean, very thin thematicness in that, but it looks nice and it feels nice. Yeah, a lot of people start at like either the what are the fun mechanics to do? Some people start at what's a fun story to tell, and if you can marry those together, it's beautiful, right? Like, it's really cool. So, did I answer your question?
Yeah.
Well, okay, cool. Yeah.
I was curious, when you're doing your testing and stuff with like other players and other people, do you have like a set mindset for like the kind of person that's playing the game, like a gamer or a non-game person like me, or somebody just outside that area that doesn't know anything?
Yeah, so part of playtesting is playtesting the demographic that you're looking for, that you think might most enjoy this game. I'm sure you did a lot of internal playtesting, you said, for Less Revolution.
Yeah.
With the boomers.
What?
With the boomers.
Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly. So there was so finding like that target market, I guess, is the best. And if that target market is your family and friends, like you're making handmade games, then maybe play test it with your family and friends, or play test it with people who are similar to your family and friends, right? If you have a kids game, play test it with kids. if, you know, and so there is that demographic in mind. I think playtesting with other game designers is helpful because it, like, they will notice things in the broad game mechanics that might be issues that other, like, players who don't have that experience of game design wouldn't catch. They might catch, this doesn't feel right, but they might not be able to explain why it doesn't feel right. And I think other game designers usually have that vocabulary and that experience to explain it.
It's like pretty much like a mechanic point out to another mechanic, hey, it's not right here.
Exactly. Versus them pointing out to somebody who doesn't know anything about cars or, you know, RC cars or whatever and saying, well, this doesn't work, and the person's like, well, okay, like, you know, it sounds funny. That's all I can tell. You know, that sort of thing. So yeah, great question.
Sorry, I know the but
Yeah, do you? Okay.
I was gonna ask, so when you're publishing your game yourself, have you had any difficulties or experience marketing your own game, how to get the word out there, kind of outside of conventions? How are you keeping it alive so people are still seeing it?
Right. So marketing is like my Achilles heel. When I first published the Super Awesome Monster Couple Party, which is my first game, I did like absolutely no marketing for it other than telling people like through Twitter and on Facebook, hey, I published a game, right? And the people who bought it online were the people who were like family, friends, close relatives, you know, that sort of thing. In terms of like a brand for Jack Piece Games, the brand is mostly me. And like my acquaintances, my connections. One of the things that the co-designer actually brought to Spotlight was his like connections in the industry and like the number of people that had seen him, because he's part of like Working Gumbo, and so he did a lot of promotion with it that I wouldn't have been able to do, just because one, he's better at marketing, and two, he just knows more people than I do in this case. For Spotlight especially, but also for My Small Garden, we had like a marketing budget where we send it out to reviewers, and we set it out to not playtesters, but like people who play board games on streams, things like that. And a lot of times those people, depending on the company or the channel, they will actually charge money for that. And that is an expense that you will have to pay for marketing, right? It's like any influencer kind of a thing. Like, yeah, you have to pay for their influence, right? Like for their time, for their energy to put into learning this game and then to like sharing the game with other people. Right. Well, and there's a big debate in board games. Like board games is a small enough industry. When something blows up, it blows up there. So a few months back, there was this, came back around again to paid reviews versus like paid like introductions to the game or how to plays, or like unboxings, that sort of thing. So like during an unboxing or during a how to play, like the people will be like, hey, we were paid to do this by the company that published this game. They're going to use this on a Kickstarter page, or you know, things like that. But it's still going out to all of their people, and they're getting a first look at how it plays, and they're getting eyeballs on that sort of thing. But that channel won't like say their opinion about the game, right? Because you're not paying them for good opinions, right? That's like not kosher, really. And so but if like a lot of times it's like, oh, they sent us a review copy, so now like they're sending a free review copy to a channel or to a stream, and then that person then can review it. And they're not getting money for the review, so they have like the ability to say, well, we really bounced off this, right? If they want to. A lot of times, if you're sending games out to like channels or YouTube or other people to, you know, market for you, you want to know what they like first. So don't send them stuff they won't like. If they don't like small card games, don't send them small card games, right? So you have to do your homework on that. Marketing is a beast of being consistent and being regular and not being perfect. And that's hard for me to do because I have that perfectionist tendencies inside of me. So I can do the like semi-regular. I can't really do the not being perfect, like just posting stuff and getting it out. So that's what I struggle with, is that marketing, getting the word out. So it's been helpful to have it in physical locations in town, because the Game Preserve has a local game designer kiosk thing, and then it sells pretty well off of that. And people will come in and be like, oh, hey, a local design game, like that sort of thing. And that's been really cool. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and physical sales are where I make most of Japanese games money, just because you get to interact with people, right? Like you get to face-to-face interaction. Also, like people are already there; they're looking for that product. They're not just happening by it on Facebook or Twitter or something like that. So yeah.
How do you think through complexity in a game? Oftentimes I feel like there's this idea that a game gets too complex, then it might not be as fun, whereas like maybe where it's very simple and it's very fun and vice versa. And so when designing the process of your game, when do you push forward and making it more complex, or scale back because of predisposed expectations on how hard it might be to explain the game? Or
Right. Complexity is one that, you have to think about. I explained earlier that the people playing the game are the computer. They are the people who do all of the actions, who do all of the things. And so if the game is too complex, then people get lost in that complexity. Usually the advice to game designers is to cut things rather than make things more complex. So if something isn't working because it's complex, don't make it more complex, don't add more rules. Figure out how you can streamline that or make it less complex. Because that will then help your players understand the totality of the game rather than these niche rules of like, well, you can't move your person here because this happened, kind of a thing. Actually, in Kaboom, there's actually a few unanswered questions that I leave up to players to decide how they want to play. So like if this one specific thing happens, I didn't write a rule, this is what you do because of it, it's not important. How players resolve that rule, right? Or how players resolve that action. And I'm okay with that, at least in like the playtesting and like the feedback that I've gotten, because it happens so rarely to have that rule in there or to have that added complexity or like that making sure that people know exactly what to do when this very niche thing happens doesn't add to the game because it's confusing for the demographic that I want to play the game. So the demographic for Kaboom is like families, younger kids, kindergarten through 5th grade, whatever, and having like these like very specific, if this thing happens, then you do this, right? Like the bare minimum of like rules is really, or what it gets to get them started is what the important thing is for the rule set. So in terms of complexity, I try to stay away from, it can be challenging, like games can be challenging. Games can have a lot going on. But there's this aspect where there's too much complexity and then it's not fun anymore, right? You've drawn that fun out because players are focused more on the complexity than playing the game, right? And so judging that is important. Yeah.
Do you have an example of a published game?
Stephen?
I haven't played Frosthaven, which is on me, but also imagining lugging around a 200-pound
Yeah,
box is
right.
not.
I mean,
Yeah, there are games where, I mean, for some players, Root is too complex. If you think about how Root plays, the asymmetric factions, that sort of thing, like they're targeting a very specific demographic with that. Gamers who enjoy complex games. It is as complex as it needs to be, and they probably pulled back the complexity from what it started out as. To be honest, they probably had a lot more things in there that they had then spun off into expansions or did some other stuff with. But the complexity of the asymmetrical factions going against each other necessitates that you have a rulebook. Like you have like 3 different rulebooks in that game. You have
I just recently learned to play Root, and there's a learn to play rulebook.
Yep.
Then there's the here's we're going to walk you through 2 turns rulebook, and then there's the full rulebook, which is a small book.
and then you have the literal appendices that's like,
Yes.
here's every, like, there's like rules buried inside the rules of the rule
And there are
book.
very, as I was pointing out, very specific interactions that I would think at that point, if you're getting down to this rule interacts with this rule in this way, and it has to be spelled out at that point,
Yeah.
you're starting to kind of overdo the complexity.
Yeah, and
Or past that point.
right, and I mean, like I enjoy playing Root. I don't understand it to its fullest because it's got a lot going on in it, right?
Indeed, but a lot more complex.
It is very complex, and a lot of people love that complexity, but it pulled out the asymmetric faction aspect, so you're only focused on how your faction. I mean, you do need to know how the other factions play to play it well, but you can play it just. You can play it just by focusing on your faction and how your faction works. But understanding how one faction works does not help you understand how another faction works, or how another one plays. That would be, I would say, tending on the high end of complexity, how board games
Exactly what you're talking about. Spirit
Yeah,
Island,
it's
which is
reminded me
Yeah.
a lot of Spirit Island,
Root
which
is-
has an online wiki
Yes.
that just like goes to the this card.
Yeah, Root is competitive asymmetric, Spirit Island is cooperative asymmetric.
Yeah.
But they're all built around the idea that what you have in front of you isn't too hard to understand, but everybody has something different.
Yeah.
And I actually was going to ask you your thoughts on symmetry versus asymmetry earlier, because that's a part of game design that I find endlessly fascinating. It's part of my miniature gaming background, it's part of how I do board games. Symmetry versus asymmetry is a wonderful topic. That said, before you bother even answering that,
Yeah.
we have about 20 minutes left.
Oh, okay.
And I wasn't sure if you wanted to dive into any of the actual boxes ring design stuff you thought, or if people are still having couple of questions, we'll just keep going with that through the end of it. Thoughts?
Yeah.
Oh, I had a question. For me, I'm a visual person. I'm visual, hearing, seeing, that kind of stuff. From my point of view, sorry, I didn't know I was supposed to. How does somebody like you, like a game designer or a game creator, explain to a non-gamer like me of rules and regulations and everything else?
Mhm.
Like, for example, what he was saying about different ways of different play styles and different things. Like,
Right. So an evolution that is interesting in game design is if you look at the rule books from like 60 years ago, there are no pictures.
Yeah.
It explains everything just by like writing it down on the page.
Or examples of like a term.
Right. There aren't really those examples. So like showing those is a huge help to me as a visual learner. Like I like to see things and how they work out. That's that spatialness. So the rules that I designed, they have like one page of kind of text, and then the opposite side of, I do my rules on cards because of how the print on demand system works. But one side is like text, and then the other side is a picture kind of explaining like how that works in the game, right? So, so I can show you some cards afterwards of like how I approach that a bit.
Okay.
But I tend to think that showing pictures can be worth quite a few words in terms of like rule book design and figuring that stuff out, because it shows players, not just tells players. Because sometimes telling players can be harder than actually just showing how it's laid out on a thing. And so often you get like the rule book, it will list contents, and then it will show like a basic setup where like it will list contents and maybe show you the contents as well. Like, oh, here's all the cards, here's all the miniatures, here's what these miniatures look like, here's what, so you don't have to guess as to like, oh, what's this thing?
Yeah.
It's showing you as well as telling you what it is. So.
That's what the part provides about the visually and audibly hearing it and seeing it. And it's like because sometimes it's kind
A
of
lot of-
complex.
A lot of newer games also have like online, like first round gameplay from the
Yeah.
designers. Like,
Yeah, I was gonna
little
say, what you
QR
just
code
said
or
of like
something.
the first couple turns, like
Yes.
Wingspan has like a, let's
Yeah.
do like the first 3 moves or something.
Right.
And they actually, like, I love how that tutorial is designed, because they walk you through like the different things that you can do, and they sort of have like, now you might want to do this because you have these cards, and so like they're kind of like priming you for like the later game, which I feel like is how a lot of people with the older manuals would teach games, because like you give people the manual and it's like, oh, it's like, okay, let's just get started, and then you kind of like explain things as you go.
Right.
That kind of
It's
goes
like-
back to your question about complexity in a lot of ways. If it's to the point that you've got to walk through the first 2 turns, you're already targeting a demographic looking for complexity.
Yeah.
If the people you're playing with, I have 2 groups that I play with. One is over here, sitting down, who does like complex games, and one is my family, who does not. And the games that we play do not mirror the games I play with my family. The games I play with my family can be explained in 5 minutes or less and take 3 pictures. The games that I play with Dakota take a lot longer,
Yeah.
and those do need that added complexity. And that's your complexity question in terms of demographic. It's
Well, also how older games were explained. Like I didn't learn Monopoly from the rule book. I learned Monopoly from my father,
yeah,
who taught me how to play Monopoly and then soundly beat me at it. So,
rightfully so.
yeah, I was like,
dominoes for my family.
yeah. So a lot of older games, you didn't really learn from the rule book. You learned from somebody else teaching you how to play, and the rule book was there for reference.
Or not.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know if this is a thing here, but I'm from Spain. There's like a very popular phrase that is like, at home we play like this, and
Yeah.
like you have to throw your hands up.
House rules are a thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, exactly. And some games will be taught to other players by like somebody who really enjoys the game. I enjoy teaching games to other people. That's something I just enjoy. But a lot of games nowadays, like if people aren't watching a how to play video, which is why I think how to play videos have exploded in popularity, because it is somebody teaching you how to play the game. But you have to learn from the rules yourself, right? So there's that. Remember that. Did you have a question? Or
No, I was
Yeah,
just
just
saying that my
stretching.
dad also taught me at Monopoly and taught me like specifically.
The rule. How much do you think that's impacted like the growth of board games? So obviously, like board games as an industry has massively exploded over the past 15 years.
15 years, yeah.
So like, I was just like thinking back to old board games and the rules and stuff, and how hard that could be to learn. I wonder how much that it's going to impacted the growth.
I think there have been a few factors impacting games. I think the rise of hobby games specifically. So this is kind of like again, like the more complex kind of style games. I think your internet, of course, has like brought in that. People, kind of doing that sort of thing. I think games have become a little bit more fun.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And better explained. And so people can explain them a little bit more. And there's also been a change in perception about board games as well. Like it's not just a kids thing anymore. Like the hobby has changed, and
There's a lot more people playing games, all different varieties. Too.
right, exactly. So I think Kickstarter has impacted the hobby game market a ton, and that's one of the blessing and curse kind of aspects.
Yeah.
It's a blessing if you enjoy games, and a curse because
The
there's so many,
endless wish
there's,
list.
like,
I can
so many
relate
good
to
games
that.
out now. But as like a publisher, it's hard to like make a mark. And for me, I know how much work goes into a Kickstarter. It's hard for me to like prepare that amount in order to actually do a Kickstarter and to fund it well.
Yeah.
So it is a lot of work, but
A lot of work that's not even making the game either.
right,
Yeah, I think
exactly.
it's-
It is very much. It's interesting. There are like those stages. There's like the production and marketing stage can look different depending on whether you're marketing yourself and your game to a publisher company who will publish it for you, or whether you're marketing it to a broader,
Kickstarter
world
type.
to buy the game or to make it a, more than just 5 copies or something, right? So, cool. Any other questions? Anything else like that? I think we'll probably skip the game design part unless you guys really want to break open Candyland and put an expansion on it.
My thought was make it hyper competitive.
Hyper competitive.
End of every turn, you roll a d3, you pick a person, they go back that many spaces. Or 4. Whatever's a bad space they can land on.
There you go. I mean, hey, that is. Sorry?
Can we get the TLDR on how you fix
How I fix Candyland?
Yeah,
I haven't really done that. I mean, honestly, the first thing I would do is put some sort of choice in there.
Yep.
So the rolling a dice or doing something like that. That's me. Somebody explained that Candyland has an interesting history. It was developed by a doctor for kids experiencing like health conditions. And so this was a game that was played by kids as an escapist kind of thing. And 2, it is for kids. And the fun that my kid has in playing Candyland is not the just, like, I don't know. I don't find the lack of choice fun. He finds fun in finding the next color that matches his card. That is the fun point for him. And that is a very different place than where I'm at, which is one of the reasons why developing kids games is difficult, because you have to like figure out where their level is, where their fun point is. And for kids, that's a great interactive thing, that's a great challenge, that's a great, fun activity for them. And that makes it a fun game for kids. So like adding expansions or changing it up in some way, that would make it fun for me, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, because it is a different demographic, it's a different, it has to be a different experience, like that sort of thing. So fixing Candyland, I don't know that Candyland necessarily needs to be fixed. I don't enjoy it when I play it, other than seeing the enjoyment on my kids' faces. And, my 2-year-old running off with some of the pieces or something like that. Like, that's kind of enjoying, like when he just goes and wipes the board. But yeah, I think, like, starting with Candyland, it's a game that people know how to play. It's easy to understand the rules. And building an expansion off of that, or building a way to make it more fun or more interesting, I think is a good way to get started in how you develop mechanics, how you put things on, but don't make it too complex, right? Like, especially for the demographic you want to play it with, right? At some point, my son's gonna find Candyland boring, right? And at that point, I can maybe add an expansion or two in order to make it more interesting again. Like maybe we actually have to maybe you put, I don't know, little dogs you have to collect all along the path. And you have to get the right cards to maybe you can go forward and backwards based on your card that you're getting, and you have to pick, do I go forwards, do I go backwards, do I pick up this dog, how do I do that, right? That would make it more interesting to me, because then you have choice and agency, not just what's the next color that's along this path, right? Yeah.
Not necessarily a question, but I really love the idea of changing a game based on developmental stages for children. Our own developmental phases go on a process. I think so.
Yeah.
The boyhood game.
Yeah.
Yeah, there
I mean, they do it with
are.
books, right?
That's been an idea that I've had of how do you develop games that hit, if I took trick taking or if I took deck building, for example, what things would I add in each developmental stage to make it a interesting experience and to kind of hit probably where they're developmentally ready for the next level of complexity. And so, building a game up that way, or having unlockable campaigns or chapters that you can unlock.
Kind of
through
like
the
the
game.
ultimate legacy game.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we can't open this packet until you're 5, so.
And we can't play 4 again.
Yeah. So yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm not trying to take up a lot more time here or anything, but speaking of people developing and stuff, for me personally, I'm colorblind, so games like this, and why I never got into games, because I can't see it. It's all black and white to me. So how would you explain to somebody who's got some type of mental illness or some type of defect or glitch or whatever you want to call it? How would you explain something like this to a person like that, and your rules and stuff like that?
So I develop a lot of my games with colorblindness in mind. So none of my games have a one-coded element, except for numbers. Numbers, you kind of have to be able to read numbers and see that. So all the colors in my games are coded in 2 different ways: it's shape and color. So you can either go by the color or you can go by the shape. So Super Awesome Monster Cuddle Party, I did this in a tricksy way. Each of the different monsters, there's a different monster for each color. Each color has a different style border around the card. So none of the borders are the same, they're all different. So even if you are colorblind, you would know this border goes with my deck, that sort of thing. It's double coded.
That helps out a lot.
And that was actually what I was going to suggest for you with Candyland, where all the spaces are just colors.
Yeah.
And that is to have somebody who is colorblind go through and just seriously take a marker and make maybe a triangle border on the yellows and maybe turn the green into an oval. And so every space would physically look different. And that could be an expansion to the game to make Candyland more accessible. It would just be an accessibility expansion.
Because if I look at it right now, to me, it looks like I'm looking at what he's wearing right now.
Right.
Well, it is gray, actually.
Oh, yeah, right.
There you go.
But yeah, what you were saying, something like that would help out a lot of gamers, people like me.
And that's a design.
Yeah.
That is a game design.
That is an aspect of playtest. So playtesting with colorblind people, playtesting with people
Quality
who,
control for you right there.
like was saying last week, boomers, right? Playtesting with people who are older who don't have the experience of a whole bunch of things that other gamers have experience with.
Yeah.
That's why it's important to playtest across a whole bunch of different demographics.
The people who I frequently game with on my weekends is very, very badly red-green colorblind and very lightly blue-yellow. And we have to, or blue, yellow-green, blue, whichever one that one is, I, off the top of my head, do not remember.
Okay.
And we have had to take that into account because he's absolutely had tokens out on the board. He's like, I can't tell the difference.
Yeah.
And we've swapped out the green for black. We just have a stash of colorless tokens that he can see the contrast between the transparent red and the black instead of transparent red, transparent green.
Yeah, that throws one off and they're colorblind.
And I think going to your and Dakota's conversation about how games have evolved over the past, 60 years, that's something that people take into account now.
Yeah.
It's something that becomes less of an issue in more current games, that accessibility, and that I'm interested to hear your opinion. Do you think that stemmed from the widespread interest in it, or do you think that's just fed back into it and made the games able to be a broader interest?
I think publishers have taken into account feedback more. I think
It's an iterative thing.
it's like it's been, and I think like generally manufacturing and entertainment industries have realized that they need to be paying attention to different disabilities and different things like that. But in the board game design, I say, well, in general, developing and or like taking into mind disabilities or different abilities means that your game is even more accessible to people who have, a range of abilities. Or so, in terms of like the color blindness, when you double code elements, which is kind of what it's called. If I am playing a game in low light, I can see shapes better than I can see colors. And so that helps me, as a person who is not colorblind, to be able to tell what elements are going on the board and what's happening, just because elements have been double coded rather than just a color.
And I'm something of the reverse. My vision is terrible, even with glasses. If a shape is too close together, circles versus say hexagons, half the time I can't tell those apart at a distance. It's the color then that allows me to do it, which is why it's not just everything's not just a shape these days.
And I'm totally opposite of you. I can see shapes and stuff like that really, really fine, but colors, it's out the window for me.
Yep.
And that's the good thing about quality control and testing and stuff. It's like, doesn't matter what industry it is, like, the feedback is always a good thing for you guys.
Oh yeah, feedback is great.
All right, we're in the last few minutes. Do we have any further questions for Adam before we keep this one off?
Cool.
I have stuck around on the tables here. These are these are books from our collection that are just on game design. Some of them are board game related. Some of them will kick into technically video game and such things as there's a book there on Unity design. It is very possible to do a digital version of a board game. And that's the sheets that I've given you all that Adam kindly emailed to me that have the keys at the bottom. Those keys are for digital versions of board games, and as far as I'm concerned in this day and age, a digital version of a board game is not really all that different from the physical one in terms of who's going to enjoy it.
Yeah, the two games that I have on here, I think it's Sean Patrick Kane, very graciously provided chess, fake chess, not actual chess, fake chess, which is a role-playing style game where you get to pretend to be a really good chess player and and do things, but it is like building off of the bones of chess, right? It's that kind of expansion idea of like, what can you do with these pieces or this cultural understanding of a game, and how can you make it even more fun or even more interesting, and that sort of thing. And I think this is a great example of that.